October 14th, 1856, Ashford, England. A coal-stained town huddled between rolling hills and industrial smokestacks, where the air itself seemed to carry the weight of inevitability. The funeral bell of St. Margaret's Church tolled through the morning mist, its bronze voice echoing off narrow cobblestone streets and soot-blackened cottages. But the gathered mourners did not speak of Margaret Thornley, the elderly woman being lowered into the earth that day. Instead, they whispered of something far more unsettling. A pale, quiet boy who had announced her death 3 days before she drew her final breath. How could a child know the exact moment when death would come calling? How could he speak names that would soon be carved into headstones, announce departures before the soul had even prepared to leave? This is the story of Thomas Weaver, a 10-year-old boy whose impossible gift would transform a small English town into a place where the future cast shadows darker than the past. In the autumn of 1856, England stood at the crossroads between old superstitions and new science. Queen Victoria ruled an empire stretching across the globe, yet in towns like Ashford, life remained brutally medieval. Coal dust settled on everything like a funeral shroud. Typhoid, cholera, and consumption stalked the narrow streets with the regularity of seasons. Mining accidents claimed men faster than they could be replaced, their bodies crushed beneath tons of earth and ambition. Death was not a stranger in Ashford. It was a permanent resident. Children grew accustomed to seeing coffins carried past their windows. Wives learned to kiss their husbands goodbye each morning, as if it might be the last time. The average life expectancy barely reached 35 years, and those who survived longer bore the scars of a world that showed no mercy to the weak. Yet for all its familiarity, death remained unpredictable. It struck without warning, without pattern, without the courtesy of announcement. That was simply how the world worked. Until Thomas Weaver changed everything. The boy first appeared in official records as the third son of Samuel Weaver, a coal hauler, and his wife Mary, a sea woman, if aged. But Thomas only nodded and returned to his play, as if he had mentioned nothing more significant than the weather. Elizabeth Hartwell, 73 years old and in reasonable health for her age, died quietly in her sleep on Saturday night, October 11th, 1856. Mary Weaver found her the next morning when she failed to appear for Sunday service. The coincidence troubled Mary, but she convinced herself it was nothing more than a child's unfortunate guess. After all, Mrs. Hartwell was elderly, and the old often passed in their sleep. Surely Thomas had simply noticed something she had missed. Perhaps the woman had seemed tired or pale or short of breath. This comfortable explanation lasted exactly 2 weeks. On October 25th, Thomas approached his mother again. This time his words carried the weight of certainty. "Mr. Blackwood from the mine will not come home tomorrow." Mary's blood ran cold. Henry Blackwood was 32 years old, strong as an ox, with a wife and 3 young children depending on his wages. He had shown no signs of illness or injury. The next evening, Henry Blackwood's broken body was pulled from the Ashford mine shaft after a support beam collapsed during the afternoon shift. He had been working alone in a section of tunnel that was considered safe, routine, unremarkable. The mine foreman could offer no explanation for the structural failure that had claimed only 1 life. Word spread through Ashford like smoke through a chimney. The boy who had spoken 2 names and been proven right both times. Some dismissed it as coincidence, the natural tendency of a morbid child in a town where death was commonplace. But others began to watch Thomas Weaver with new eyes, and those eyes were filled with fear. By winter's arrival, the whispers had become conversations, and the conversations had become testimonies. Sarah Mills, a baker's wife, swore that Thomas had warned her not to let her husband visit his ailing brother in the next village. When she ignored the boy's odd warning, her husband contracted scarlet fever during that very visit and died within the week. James Fletcher, a coal merchant, recalled a morning when Thomas had tugged at his coat sleeve. The rest. When will he tell me how many days I have left? Martha Green died of a heart attack on November 19th, exactly 1 week after Thomas had spoken her name. By the spring of 1857, Thomas Weaver had become the most feared child in Ashford. Parents crossed the street when they saw him coming. Shopkeepers found excuses to close their doors when he approached. Even the other children avoided him, warned by their elders that the pale boy carried death in his words, like other children carried marbles in their pockets. The local vicar, Reverend Jonathan Blackthorne, felt compelled to address the growing hysteria from his pulpit. In a sermon delivered on Easter Sunday, 1857, he proclaimed, "We must not allow superstition to poison our Christian faith. God alone knows the hour of our departure from this earthly realm. No child, no matter how strange his utterances, can possess such divine knowledge." Yet even Reverend Blackthorne found himself unsettled by Thomas Weaver. According to his private correspondence with the Bishop of Winchester, the Reverend wrote, "The boy troubles me greatly. It is not merely what he says, but how he says it. There is no malice in his predictions, no satisfaction in being proven correct. He speaks of death as casually as others speak of rain, as if he is merely reporting what he observes, rather than prophesying what is to come. This, perhaps, is what makes him most terrifying of all." The magistrate, Sir Edmund Rothwell, arrived in Ashford in May of 1857 with the express purpose of investigating what he termed the alleged supernatural phenomena. He was a man of science and reason, educated at Oxford, skeptical of ghost stories and village superstitions. He intended to expose Thomas Weaver as either a fraud or the victim of mass hysteria. Sir Edmund's investigation lasted 3 weeks. He interviewed dozens of witnesses, examined medical records, consulted with the mine foreman and local physicians. His final report, filed with the county authorities, concluded, "Arrived in 1857, the town had become a place where fear walked hand in hand with faith. Some believed Thomas was blessed with a divine gift, chosen by God to prepare souls for their journey to the afterlife. Others whispered that he was cursed, perhaps even in league with darker forces that sought to harvest human souls before their appointed time. The boy himself seemed unaware of the terror he inspired. He continued to attend school when other children would let him, played alone in the streets when they would not, and spoke his terrible predictions with the same innocent clarity with which he might comment on the weather or the color of the sky. Then came the day that would seal Thomas Weaver's fate and cement his place in the dark folklore of Ashford. It was July 23rd, 1857, during the morning service at St. Margaret's Church. Reverend Blackthorne was delivering a sermon on the nature of divine providence when Thomas Weaver stood up in his pew. The congregation fell silent as the pale boy turned to look directly at the vicar. "You will not finish this week's sermons, Reverend," Thomas said, his young voice carrying clearly through the stone sanctuary. "Thursday will be your last day in this world." The church erupted in gasps and whispered prayers. Reverend Blackthorne, his face pale but his voice steady, commanded the boy to sit down and remain silent. But the damage was done. The prophecy had been spoken in God's own house, before dozens of witnesses, concerning a man who appeared to be in perfect health. For 3 days the town held its collective breath. Reverend Blackthorne continued his duties with apparent calm, visiting the sick, counseling the troubled, preparing for Sunday's service. He showed no signs of illness or distress. On Wednesday evening, he wrote in his personal journal, "If I am to die tomorrow, as that strange child has proclaimed, then let it be known that I go to my Maker with faith intact and conscience clear. Perhaps this is God's way of testing, not just my faith, but the faith of all Ashford." Thursday, July 26, 1857, dawned clear and neighboring villages, then to the county seat, then to London itself. Government officials who had already received Sir Edmund Rothwell's disturbing report began to take a more active interest in the boy who could predict death. According to local witnesses, including the postmaster and the station master, several well-dressed men arrived in Ashford during the first week of August, 1857. They asked pointed questions about Thomas Weaver, examined church records, and spoke at length with the boy's parents. The visitors claimed to represent various government departments, though their exact authority was never made clear. What happened next remains one of the great mysteries in the annals of unexplained phenomena. On August 15, 1857, Thomas Weaver disappeared. His parents claimed he had been sent to live with relatives in Scotland, away from the notoriety and fear that surrounded him in Ashford. But no relatives could be located. No forwarding address was ever provided, and no records of any Scottish Weaver family accepting custody of a child were ever discovered. Some witnesses reported seeing the well-dressed government men leaving town on the same day Thomas vanished, their carriage moving swiftly toward London under cover of pre-dawn darkness. Others claimed to have seen the boy walking alone along the moor road, heading north toward destinations unknown. The truth died with those who knew it, buried beneath layers of official silence and deliberate obscurity. In the months following Thomas's disappearance, strange reports began to filter in from villages throughout northern England. A child matching his description was reportedly seen in Whitby, where 3 fishermen died in an unexpected storm after locals claimed a pale boy had warned them not to set sail. Similar accounts emerged from York, where a young boy had allegedly predicted a building collapse that killed 2 construction workers, and from Newcastle, where witnesses swore they had seen Thomas Weaver walking through the market square days before a cholera outbreak claimed 7 lives. Yet none of these sightings could be confirmed. The boy seemed to appear and vanish like morning mist, leaving behind only the echo of the century. Ashford had become little more than a collection of abandoned cottages and fading memories. The few remaining residents rarely spoke of the past, and when they did, it was always in whispers, as if saying Thomas Weaver's name too loudly might somehow summon him back. Modern investigators have attempted to verify the historical record surrounding Thomas Weaver and his alleged predictions. Church records confirm the deaths of all the individuals mentioned in contemporary accounts, and the dates align precisely with the testimonies preserved in letters, diaries, and official reports. Medical records, where they exist, show no unusual patterns or circumstances that might have made these deaths predictable through conventional means. Dr. Margaret Whitfield, a professor of anomalous psychology at Cambridge University, spent 3 years researching the Thomas Weaver case in the 1990s. Her conclusions were unsettling. Either we are dealing with an elaborate hoax perpetrated by dozens of unconnected individuals across multiple years, which seems statistically impossible, or we must accept that Thomas Weaver possessed an ability that challenges our fundamental understanding of time, causality, and the nature of human consciousness. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Thomas Weaver case is not what happened in 1857, but what continues to happen today. Reports still surface, roughly once every decade, of a pale child who appears in small towns and remote villages across the British Isles. The boy is always described the same way: quiet, serious beyond his years, with eyes that seem to focus on something beyond the visible world. He speaks to adults in passing, mentioning names, making casual observations about who will not live to see the next week or month. And then, inevitably, the predictions come true. The child is never there long enough to be questioned or studied. He appears, speaks his terrible truths, and vanishes like smoke on the wind, leaving behind only the confirmation of his impossible knowledge and the growing list of those who have heard death whisper their name through a child's innocent voice. In 2003, in the village of Little Wickham, fate itself. Was Thomas Weaver truly gifted with the ability to see through the veil that separates present from future? Or was he something else entirely, an agent of death itself, walking among the living to announce the appointments that had already been made in some cosmic ledger we cannot comprehend? If death can indeed be predicted, does this mean our fates are sealed from the moment we draw our first breath? Are we all simply following a script written by forces beyond our understanding, playing out roles that were assigned to us before time began? Or is there something even more disturbing at work? The possibility that by speaking death's name, Thomas Weaver was not predicting it, but somehow calling it into being, giving voice to a power that shapes reality through the simple act of recognition. These questions have no comfortable answers. They force us to confront the possibility that the world operates according to rules we do not understand, guided by forces we cannot control, shaped by knowledge we were never meant to possess. The funeral bell of St. Margaret's Church last tolled on an autumn morning in 1879, marking the death of the final resident of old Ashford. But if you visit the abandoned village today, if you walk among the crumbling cottages and overgrown gardens, you might still hear an echo of that bronze voice carrying across the moors, and you might find yourself wondering, as so many have wondered before, whether you would want to know the date of your own death if a pale child approached you on a quiet street and spoke your name with the casual certainty of one who has seen tomorrow's obituaries written in today's shadows. Would you want to know? Would you want to count the days, hours, and minutes until your final breath? Would you want to live with the terrible knowledge that your story has already been written, your ending already decided, your departure already scheduled in death's appointment book? Or would you prefer to live as most of us do, in blessed ignorance of the moment when our names will be called, when our earthly performance will reach its final curtain, when we will join the long procession of souls who have walked this stage before us and will walk it long after we are gone? Perhaps that is the true horror of Thomas Weaver's gift, not the eyes of a child, who can see your ending written in the space between heartbeats, carved into the silence between words, waiting in the shadows of tomorrow. The funeral bell has stopped ringing, but death's appointments continue to be kept, and somewhere in the darkness between what we know and what we fear, a pale boy walks on, carrying tomorrow's obituaries in his pocket, like other children carry sweets, speaking names that should not yet be spoken, announcing departures that should not yet be scheduled. Thomas Weaver may have disappeared from Ashford in 1857, but he has never truly left. He walks still in the spaces between certainty and doubt, between faith and fear, between the life we think we control and the death that controls us all. Listen carefully on quiet evenings, when the wind carries whispers across empty moors and abandoned towns. Listen for the voice of a child who knows too much, who sees too far, who carries the weight of tomorrow's sorrows in his young heart, and pray that when he speaks, your name is not among the words that fall from his lips like autumn leaves, beautiful, inevitable, and marking the end of something that can never return. The bell may have stopped tolling in Ashford, but somewhere it tolled still. And Thomas Weaver, the boy who predicted every death in his town, continues his eternal walk through the borderlands of fate, carrying his terrible gift like a lantern in the darkness, illuminating truths we were never meant to see. Would you want to know? The question echoes still, unanswered and unanswerable, waiting for each of us to discover our own response when faced with the impossible choice between knowledge and ignorance, between certainty and hope, between the comfort of not knowing and the terror of knowing too much. In the end, perhaps that is the most haunting legacy of Thomas Weaver. Not the deaths he predicted, but the questions he raised about the nature of fate, the meaning of free will, and the price of seeing beyond the veil that mercifully hides tomorrow from our sight. The boy who predicted every death in his town taught us that sometimes the most terrible gift of all